welcome to this special discussion, which I think is going to be a potentially lively one, who knows, but I think an interesting one. So, anyone who watches the channel regularly, or anyone who's clicked on this video because they'll have seen the title and the thumbnail, is going to be aware of antinatalism, right? It's something that I talk about a lot on my channel. Well, obviously, it's basically the whole channel. But sometimes it's good to go back to basics and actually talk about what is it that we're discussing, because I'm sure many people on many subjects have had a discussion with someone when they're talking about a topic and it ends up going around in circles because you're using the same word but in different ways. And as I'm sure anyone who's got any experience with the antinatalist community knows, it's got a wide variety of people with a wide variety of interpretations in it. So what I wanted to do was have a discussion around what actually is antinatalism, bring three different people who I think have three different perspectives, and discuss actually what we think antinatalism is. So I've got with me Les Knight, who calls himself the finder, not the founder, of the voluntary human extinction movement. Matt, who runs the channel Life Sucks, which I'm sure everyone watching will know. And Ethan, who runs the channel Meta Ethics, which I think everyone will also know, because I've also just recently done a video with Ethan on antinatalism in Australia. If you want to find out anything about anyone here, links will be in the description as always. But I thought we could actually kick things off, not by talking about antinatalism, but by talking about so antinatalism is anti-natalism. So I wanted to actually I thought we'd start on the flip side. And what do each of you define natalism as? Ethan, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I guess natalism is typically referred to as relating to birth. Um, so as I think as we get to how I define antinatalism, I think that there's liberties taken with how natalism is used in the definition. Um,
Mm.
there is actually like a natalism subreddit that I've come across, which is essentially an anti-natalism subreddit. It's quite an odd community, I'd say.
Yeah. And Matt, what do you when someone says the word natalism, what do you think? Like, what would you define that as?
Yeah, so just for fun, this might be a point, we can start a discussion on. So I looked up the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition, and there's a website called Wiktionary, which is like Wikipedia dictionary.
Mm.
And they have definitions of it. So Merriam-Webster says, noun, an attitude or policy favoring or encouraging population growth, which I thought was kind of interesting. So instead of
Mm.
birth, they say population growth. So
Yeah.
that's someone who wrote that must have been thinking of the overpopulation problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the Wiktionary says natalism or pronatalism is an ideology in favor of childbearing, which is a little bit closer to what we think of as antinatalism,
Yeah.
although these are anthropocentric, so not involving animals.
Mm.
Um, yeah, natalism, it's because animals don't have a choice to procreate. I guess most people think of the word natalism, they think of the prevailing philosophy in the world, every country in the world, that we should be congratulated for nataling people into existence, and that it's overall good to procreate.
Mm.
That's how I see natalism.
Yeah, yeah, you've brought up some interesting points actually, which I want to comment on. But Les, do you wanna go first before
Yeah,
before I
yes,
go?
I think what Matt said, and the dictionary too. I think natalism was the original ideology, clear back when we were hunters and gatherers. A new member of the tribe. This is good. And as time went on, the patriarchy became interested in enforcing births because it's more people to defend the tribe and to attack the other tribes. And the empires really needed more and more people. Now, this has continued today with the patriarchy just really going at it like crazy, preventing people from not procreating. So all societies have evolved to be natalist, and institutions too, especially churches and so on, because if a society wasn't natalist, they would be
Mm,
overrun by those who were. And
mm,
in the Hebrew Bible, it talks about the quiverful, meaning lots of children. They're your
mm,
arrows, and so it's really insidious and ubiquitous, and it's really what we're fighting against. Well, anti-natalism. I think lately I've been thinking about pro-natalism being slightly different than natalism. I've just
mm.
described natalism as the original ideology, but pro-natalism, I think, are efforts to encourage natalism, to encourage childbirth. So that's what I think.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting, like you were saying, Les, like in not just the modern day, but also in the sort of historical records that we have access to. Obviously, there's a lot of human history which we don't have, really access to. A detailed picture on how people lived, what they thought, that sort of stuff. But it's definitely the case that a lot of institutions have risen up which really rely on new flesh and blood coming through the ranks. So it's sort of, at least implicitly, pro-natalist institutions. And something you said as well, Matt, was made me think. It was smart of you to get up the definitions there. And it was interesting that the first one you read out was about population, um, because it's interesting. And this is the reason I asked this question. It's interesting how people interpret words differently. So whenever I hear natalism or pronatalism, I always think of like a philosophical ideology of saying like it's morally okay or preferable to do this action of bringing someone into the world. But actually, the definition you read out was not philosophical at all, at least the first one. It was purely just about population and demographics. Um, that was really interesting. Um, so now that we've kind of etched out what there may be different interpretations of what natalism is, how do each of you define antinatalism? And just for transparency and stuff for the people watching, I asked each of you to have a think about before we started this recording, like what do you actually think antinatalism is in terms of a definition, but what are the actual essential features of it? Like what needs to be included for antinatalism to be antinatalism? So Les, do you want to go first on this one?
Sure. Yeah. I, in thinking about it, as you asked me, I think there is a broad definition, which is it just, and I've seen it used in articles too. It is assigning a negative to procreation, uh, and then I make the distinction with the philosophy. I think that's a very specific. Antinatalism is a philosophy, and that's what we're working on here. But to me, the most basic core is we have no right to bring someone into existence. And then we can add to it with it's immoral and unethical. And in consent education, we learn that the absence of a no is not a yes. I mean, we they can't say no, and so that means there's not a yes. And so like so many things, it starts out with just a kernel, and then we build and build, and it's like, okay, we shouldn't be breeding domesticated animals either, and it keeps going from there. But I think that's the core: is that we have no right to bring someone into existence.
Okay, so you've got there basically like there's this core thing that is like a broad base, and then there's many different interpretations built off of that, and people have different flavors of antinatalism, which
Mm-hmm.
I think is it's definitely the case that there is this broad base, whatever that is, and that then off that people have built different sort of schools of thought based around a similar foundation that we tend to refer to as antinatalism. Ethan, do you want to go next on this one?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I have a fair bit to say on this. I'm familiar with what Les is talking about, that there's like typically this quite a broad definition as an opposition to birth. So Wikipedia says antinatalism is a philosophical position that assigns a negative value judgment to birth and views procreation as immoral. Um, and I guess this broad definition allows for lots of subcategories, such as you've got vehement or just like overpopulation awareness groups, ethylism, what have you, can all be characterized as antinatalist in a sense. Um, but I think this definition, that assigns a negative value judgment to birth, doesn't necessarily capture my view. And I believe my view is essentially just the same as David Benatar's. Yet, like, it would be extremely strange to call Benatar not an antinatalist. Some people think he even coined that term, but seems like we don't know exactly where it comes from. So the way I would define it is probably something like antinatalism is a philosophy that considers coming into existence to be a harm for the being brought into existence. So I believe that's how Benatar characterizes it, and that's what we can derive from the asymmetry. Um,
Mm.
but a nuance with this definition is that it doesn't entail that having children is always 100% wrong. What it does entail is that it's a harm to the child. Um, because I think, one thing I consider about antinatalism is, I don't know if you guys have ever heard the argument from ecological niches, but I know this is probably in direct opposition to Les's view. Um, but it states that for every human born in a first world country, wildlife is taken over and thus wild animal suffering and births are reduced. So I think whether or not it's always 100% wrong to birth a human is something that I'm not, I suppose I'm agnostic on. I'm not convinced that it is. And I think Benatar is more convinced than I am, but I think I've got essentially the same position as him.
Mm. Cool. So let's like put a pin in that and come back to that. Because what I want to do is go around and let each people sort of give their view first, and then we can come back and revisit what people have said.
Sure.
But yeah, I think what you've said is very interesting, and the answer I'm going to give somewhat mirrors what you say, but I think differs slightly. But anyway, Matt, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. My answer is going to be a little long because I consider myself an artist activist, and I mostly promote the works and definitions by other philosophers and other thinkers. So I just wanted to go through some of the broader categories of this term and this philosophy and this activism. Um, so generally, there tends to be two different camps: the Sentiocentric, which means basically all sentient life. Every animal with a brain that's having experiences is under the umbrella of antinatalism. And then I would include Benatarian antinatalism. I'd include ethylist antinatalism under that. Then you have the Anthropocentric, which I would kind of lump the environmentalist. I believe the vehement view could be considered anthropocentric, and that is more in favor of human extinction. And then, of course, there's the whole extinction thing. Like some antinatalists, strangely, are against people having kids, but they're not necessarily extinctionists, even though that's where it logically leads you to. So, as many of you know, there is no official, like Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of antinatalism.
Mm.
But again, the Wiktionary, which is just something that anyone can edit, says antinatalism is a philosophical or sociological term that asserts a negative value judgment towards birth. So that's kind of interesting in that birth can also be applied to all animals, not just human beings. So you could consider their definition to be sentiocentric. Then there's the Wikipedia definition, which originally, Wikipedia changes over time because people edit it. It was antinatalism is a philosophical position and social movement that assigns a negative value to birth. And then the definition over the past year or two was re-edited, and it now says antinatalism is the philosophical position that assigns a negative value to birth and views procreation as immoral. So I kind of like that instead of just saying a negative value judgment, they say it's immoral. They should probably use the word unethical, but immoral works. Antinatalists thus argue that humans should abstain from procreating. So I think that's a better dictionary definition. And then, of course, we have Urban Dictionary, which is more of a sarcastic kind of website. But they have a definition for antinatalist, which says a dude or chick that thinks having children is immoral. Typically also thinks the world is mainly suffering. May also be defined as a bleeding heart to the extreme.
Good.
Okay, so now I want to bring some of the main philosophers of antinatalism and bring in their views. So I went to a great YouTube page. It's also available on many other places like Spotify, but that's the Exploring Antinatalism podcast. And two of the probably leading experts on the definition of antinatalism would be Amanda Sukanik and Mark J. Maharaj, who created that podcast. And they tend to ask almost every guest, what their definition of antinatalism is. So I went through those videos and captured some of their thoughts. So if that's all right with you, I'll read.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Okay, what they said about this subject. Okay, so David Benatar, who of course is the author of Better Never to Have Been, probably the most famous book in antinatalism, and that really puts forward the logical argument for the philosophy. And so Amanda Sukina reads him the Wikipedia definition, and he says, out of some concerns about that, because antinatalism, the word natalism, does refer to birth. Obviously, there's some liberties taken there to its opposition to bringing sentient beings into existence. Birth is, in a way, a marker for that, but it's not, I believe, the actual point at which somebody would come into existence, in which a sentient being would come into existence. So I have that concern about the wiki definition. I think it's not so much about being in opposition to birth as in opposition to bringing beings into existence. And then, that's the subtitle of his book, is The Harm of Coming into Existence. And if you ask for what kinds of beings are those, I think it specifically sentient beings. Whether it's simply assigning a negative value or whether it could be sometimes be suggesting that we outright ought not to do it. So it could have negative value, but the negative value might be outweighed by the considerations. And I'll certainly say there are some antinatalists who would have that view. But that's a relatively weak view in comparison with the one that suggests that we ought to be bringing these new sentient beings into existence. I'm not suggesting that that definition is bad. It's good because it's more inclusive, but wouldn't fully capture the views of some antinatalists who would not simply be assigning negative value, but who would be going one step further and saying that the negative value is not outweighed by the considerations, and therefore would not be bringing these sentient beings into existence. So sorry, that's not a great blur, but that's David Benatar, what he said. So then the second most, so that's the most popular interview on exploring antinatalism for obvious reasons. And the second most popular interview was with Inmendham, who is a YouTube philosopher and the founder of Ethylism. Ethylism is based on the word Ethel, which is life spelled backwards. And he considers it to be more of an anti-life philosophy. So this is his quote, a response to the same question. He says, antinatalism and ethylism are the same. Anti-lifism is what I've carried with me my whole life, so it's absolutely nothing different. So nothing changed to say, oh, it's time to be ethylist, or I advance to ethylism. I don't advance there. It's already the real point. Again, the reason why I made up the word was to make a distinction between my version of anti-lifism and the version being spouted by other people. So we aren't the same thing. We're both anti-life, but they're for the wrong reasons, in my opinion. So I had to call myself something else. That's all. I would say it's just a word. There is no ethylism. There's just this principle philosophy that's based on the first do no harm thing. That's all it really is. It's that simple. Your first obligation is to torture nothing. Benatar never makes the argument from dog or cat or mouse, or he never makes it from a gazelle to a crocodile and this to that. So there's no evidence that he has any of the metaphors or any of the stories that run through his head to make it understood that it's futility and waste, and that those victims are anything other than a human victim. So he thinks that, Benatar does have a couple lines in his book that this should apply to all sentient animals on the planet. But he really comes at it from, that's like his main point of view, is that this is anti-life. There is no distinguishing between humans and animals. If you don't mind, I have a couple other philosophers I would like to mention, if that's all right.
Yeah, go on.
Okay, one is David Pearce. He's a transhumanist, so he's a negative utilitarian. He tries to say there's two different kinds of antinatalism, soft and hard. But he's definitely in the Sentiocentric category. So he says one of the reasons some forms of antinatalism don't fully address the problem. The most suffering in the living world isn't experienced by humans. Life in a state of nature is mostly nasty, brutish, and short for non-human animals. Most animals lead desperate existences. While I don't believe they experience depression like on captive factory farms, they still face significant challenges. The living world is incredibly grim. For the first time in history, we have the ability to regulate the level of suffering in nature. Global stewardship of the biosphere can bring suffering under control and eventually eliminate it. End quote. And that's just a distinction between his philosophy and ethylism, is that transhumanists, they're about genetically altering animals, maybe getting rid of predation, whereas ethylism is about extinction only. It's about a graceful exit, just ending life, basically.
Yeah.
Pierce continues, if humans were to go extinct tomorrow, there would be hundreds of millions of years of more pain and misery and suffering. However, if we assume responsibility for the global stewardship of the biosphere, we can bring suffering under control within a few centuries and eventually eliminate it. Every cubic meter of the planet can be computationally accessible for micromanagement and control. Technical fixes, such as genetic tweaking, can be employed to address issues like predation. For example, we can convert obligate predators and herbivores through genetic modification using catnip-flavored cultured meat as a stopgap measure. End quote. Now I have one more quote from someone you guys might know. His name's Les Unite. And he has one of the more popular interviews on the podcast as well. So this is just Les's. Les already spoke, but I just want to read what he said back then. He says, quote, there are various forms of antinatalism, but basically is it against the idea that births are good in favor of the concept that we have no right to bring someone into the world where they will suffer, as Les just said. From there, people can develop their own ideas and questions. Antinatalism has evolved over the years, and it has somewhat moved away from environmentalism, which used to be a significant part of it. Am I disappointed in that? Not at all. Antinatalism is specifically one major route to the awareness that we should go extinct. Concern for the environment, non-human animals, wildlife, and humans are all connected to the concept of humans voluntarily going extinct. People can define antinatalism however they want, and I'm not disappointed that people have different thoughts. I don't actively promote antinatalism, and I don't delve into it exclusively in my discussions. I prefer to keep the focus on the positive aspects of vehement, voluntary human extinction movement. While I agree that life is suffering and we shouldn't bring someone into it, I don't like dwelling on the negative. I prefer to talk about the potential for a wonderful world with fewer of us, where everyone's needs are provided for, and we coexist harmoniously with nature, end quote. So there you have, 4 different slightly variations on the subject. For me, myself, I'm an ethylist, sentiocentric, antinatalist, extinctionist. So I'd like to see us, genetically engineering some animals. It's not a terrible idea, but it'd be better to just phase all life out. Maybe start in the oceans or something. Because I would be afraid if humans go extinct first, as Pierce said, a lot of suffering would be left on the planet. So there's my spiel.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly give my opinion on sort of what antinatalism is, or current views, and then what I'm going to do is revisit a couple of things that each of you have said, and we can sort of open it up for discussion and stuff. And please, at any point, just butt in with me or each other to ask questions and whatever, pushback or all of that good stuff. So for me, my view of antinatalism is somewhat morphed in the past couple of months. So previously I would have just defined it as something like the view that creating a being that can suffer is immoral, or a harm, something like that, something like that, that's kind of a bit I don't know, all encompassing, as you may say. In the past couple of months, through speaking to one particular person who I won't name in case they don't want to be named on this, but for a video I've been researching for, so I'm currently I basically finished the script. I just need to video it, a video on whether animals should be included in antinatalism or not, and what that would look like, what the implications of that would be, all of that sort of stuff. And through doing research for that, and speaking to a friend who was helping me with that, he introduced me to a way of viewing antinatalism that breaks it into two constituent parts, which I'm not sure you would be able to neatly wrap up into a sentence and put in a dictionary. But I think that at least trying to understand it in this way, it was very helpful for me. And the way that it was broken up, or that he was talking about them being broken up, and this has been done by specific philosophers that he did say about, but I've forgotten who they were. Maybe some of you will know. But he spoke about breaking antinatalism up into two constituent parts. One part, which I think all of you did mention, was an evaluative part, about evaluating what coming into existence is like for the individual that is being created. And I think when it comes to antinatalism, that evaluative part has to be that it is a harm, that coming into existence is a harm for the individual involved. That seems to be like the all-encompassing underpinning thing. But then there seems to be a second part to it, which is more of a normative or a judgmental part, which is more paying attention to the action of bringing someone into existence, which then you would start to use language like immoral or unethical. So the normative or evaluative part would seem to be that since creating a new being is a harm to them, it is therefore unethical to create them. So there seem to be these two parts, where the evaluative part is focusing on the individual being created, saying it's a harm for them, and the normative part is focusing on the person who's doing the creating, saying that they have done something immoral or unethical. So it was kind of interesting thinking about antinatalism in that way, breaking it down into two parts, each part seemingly being fundamental to antinatalism, but each of them having a different focus, because obviously antinatalism is concerning something which has two parties, the one being created and the one/ones, obviously, because you need two people, the ones creating them, right? These two parties. So I found that really interesting. And that way of understanding antinatalism and defining it, even though it's a kind of a bit of a messy way to define it, you can't really sum it up in that way. You kind of have to explain it rather than have like a punchy bullet point. But that seems to be like the way that I'm thinking about it at the moment, and it leads me into a question which I think would be really interesting to get each of your answers on, because I think at least Matt and Ethan mentioned something which is directly relevant to this. So I think basically all antinatalists somewhat recognize existence as a harm, given that there's suffering in life. I think the bit that people more dispute is the normative part, when we can make moral judgments about the action. And Ethan mentioned this. He said that you, and please call me out if I'm misquoting you, but something along the lines of that existence is a harm, but that doesn't necessarily imply that it is always wrong to do, because there might be other mitigating factors, right? So my question was, for each of you, could it be conceivable that under some definition of antinatalism, procreation is actually moral? Which I think is an interesting thing to think about. So I'm not sure if anyone particularly wants to take this first, or I can randomly choose someone.
I'll take it.
Okay, go on, Les.
I don't think that the intentional creation of one more of us by anyone, anywhere, can be justified. Even if you're not an antinatalist, just looking at what the future is going to be like should be reason enough. But of course, antinatalism is a good reason as well. Creating a new person is exploitative. Like, a couple, we want a child. Well, they're only a child a little while. I mean, you just want to have a kitten or a puppy and turn them loose afterwards. So no, I don't think that the intentional creation of another human can ever be justified.
And Ethan and Matt, what do you guys think about that? Do you agree with Les, or are you like complete opposite direction?
Well, I'm happy to go. I'll say you basically got that right, Lawrence. I I think probably the biggest disagreement between Les and me would be that uh, Les, you don't apply uh, you don't apply the idea that we shouldn't bring more beings into existence to animals. That's correct, right? Only human animals.
No, I make a distinction between domesticated animals, which we have created and are only here because of our actions, and wild animals, which were here before us and I'm hoping will be here after us.
Right. So I think that would explain why you and I would certainly disagree on this, um, because I think that we should also get rid of wild animals. I view the wildlife as just this place of intense suffering, animals eating each other alive, otherwise even herbivorous animals dying of starvation and whatnot. I think that if we create humans in the first world, I'm not saying this is necessarily right, I'm just saying it's a possibility, then we can decrease the population of wild animals so much that the harm would be outweighed. However, I have some difficulties with it. Like I do think it's a rights violation to bring somebody into existence. So that's something I struggle with. However, when I look at you how severe I see wildlife to be, I think surely this could, if this is really true, then it could certainly outweigh the harm of bringing somebody into existence.
Matt, what do you think? Because you've mentioned when you were giving that sort of overview of different philosophers who responded to the questions that Mark and Amanda asked them, you mentioned, and I might be missing some, but you mentioned Inmendham and David Pearce, who, and maybe David Benatar, but I'm not aware of anywhere where he's particularly commented on this, but definitely Inmendham and David Pearce seem to both hold a position where actually procreation would be necessary to achieve the ends that they want to achieve. So do you think that perhaps under ethylism or transhumanism, procreation could actually be moral, in at least in the present day?
Yeah, it could. It's something that might be hard for some people to wrap their heads around. But Emendum, David Pierce, and I are what what are called negative utilitarians. So that's a form of consequentialism. So nothing is really right or wrong unless the consequences are right or wrong. Um, so, for example, David Benatar wrote a book called The Human Predicament, saying that overall death is bad. It's a bad thing, but not if someone's suffering, from horrible cancer and death is a release from the suffering. So then you can see death as a good thing. Yes, there's many negatives to bringing someone into existence. It violates their consent. It harms them. Um, it harms the world. That's the misanthropic argument for antinatalism.
Mm.
But yeah, if we had some kind of foreknowledge that someone coming into existence could prevent millions or billions coming into existence, then of course it's just a mathematical equation. It would be worth, even though it's still really wrong to impose on that one person. The consequences of that person coming into existence could be positive. So then, in that way, yes, and especially if you have the effortless plan to make the world extinct, or in Pierce's plan to reduce suffering through genetic manipulation, then yeah, as the world dwindles and dwindles, you'd probably have to keep a few people alive, unless you could make some kind of artificial intelligence that could do it for us. I mean, that would probably be ideal. Then no one would have to be harmed. But yeah, you're right. From a
Mm.
consequentialist perspective, almost anything could be seen as good if the consequences are good.
Mm.
I'm
Yeah, I
actually
think
quite
it's
surprised to hear you say that, Matt. For whatever reason, I had an intuition that you would disagree or find my view a bit repugnant, but it sounds like you basically share the same view as me. Is that right?
Mm. I agreed with most of what you said. I don't believe in rights, so I don't believe in the rights violation part, but I agreed with almost everything else you said. Yeah.
yeah. So I thought this specific topic would be really interesting to discuss because um, I think a lot of people, I think Matt, you already said this, but like, yeah, a lot of people would find this really counterintuitive, um, and really um, surprising to hear an antinatalist say. Now, I don't think any of us here are necessarily saying that we have a crystal ball. We know exactly if you're taking it from a consequentialist position, none of us know exactly what the consequences of our actions are going to be. It's almost impossible to know, right? Because the universe is so complex. Um, but I think what at least Ethan and Matt are saying is that it's conceptually possible that an antinatalist could view in at present maybe many circumstances where procreation could be um, moral, uh, and it, like when I was thinking about that, it kind of interested me in how that may change where we put the emphasis in the definition, because like I was saying before, the way I'm thinking about it at the moment is breaking it down into these two constituent parts, the evaluative part and the normative part. And it seems like um, that argument that you were talking about, Ethan, I think people call it like the niche replacement argument. A lot of people use it as an argument against antinatalism, but to me, when I hear the niche replacement argument, it seems like an antinatalist argument, because it's basically saying, yeah, it does seem like coming into existence is a harm for at least many beings, and so they're basically just saying human procreation may be a means to even greater prevention of beings coming into existence. So it doesn't seem to me at all like a antinatalist argument. It just seems like an argument that is a bit um I think maybe it it's an, I think often a lot of antinatalists have debates around antinatalism which are based in the philosophical realm, but the niche replacement argument is one that's very much based in the practical realm. It's like these are going to be the practical outcomes of real world decisions that we make, and so this may actually change how we understand the philosophical definition of antinatalism. So coming back to the two constituent parts, it seems to me like the most sensible thing to do is to put the majority of the emphasis of the definition on the fact that coming into existence is a harm, rather rather than putting more emphasis on the normative part of it, because the normative part of it gets very messy, especially on a consequentialist view, maybe less on a deontological view, because then you can just say, no, I think this is wrong for X, Y, Z, and therefore I always think it's immoral. Yeah, do any of you have any more comments on that before I sort of open up a slightly different branch of conversation?
Yes. So I've heard it called the argument from ecological niches, and you're right. I actually first heard it as an argument against antinatalism. So Matt, I know you're aware of this person. I don't know about you, Lawrence and Les, but there is a YouTuber called Ask Yourself who
Yeah.
describes himself as being
Yeah.
against antinatalism. And
Yeah, I just remembered why Matt is familiar with Ask Yourself.
yeah, you've had some I suppose some discourse. There's a bit of a series
Yeah.
of videos between the two
Anyway,
of you.
sorry, Ethan.
um, uh, and so I've spoken over voiced with Ask Yourself a few times about this, and it seems like he considers antinatalism to just mean like birth is wrong right now. Everybody needs to stop having kids. Um, and I think that if that's all your view is, then he's against it. But when I spoke to him, it seemed as if Ask Yourself and I had a lot of common ground. Um, so much to the extent that I was really surprised to see Ask Yourself said that if he had, let's say, like a button to just painlessly delete the universe, he would press it, which, as somebody who describes himself as being against antinatalism, I thought, how can you be against antinatalism and press that button? Which, sort of led me to refine my definition a little bit.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting. It's sort of like I don't know, like often, and I know that this whole discussion is kind of about a label, like the label of antinatalism, but often labels kind of get in the way of things, right? Like we hear someone is anti-antinatalism or a pro-natalist or something like that, and it kind of leads us to assume certain conclusions we think that they may have drawn. Um, and then it turns out, we actually may share a lot of common ground. We just don't happen to identify with the same term, or we interpret it in different ways. And I've had the same experience as you, Ethan, like with a range of different people. You go in assuming something about someone on the topic of antinatalism, and it actually turns out either you have way less common ground or way more common ground. Like there are some people who don't call themselves antinatalists that I have more common ground with than some people who call themselves antinatalists. So sometimes these labels, they do kind of get in the way. So I don't know if I'm encouraging that by hosting this conversation, but whatever, you know. Does anyone else have anything to say on that topic before I open something slightly different up? Okay, cool. All right, so this next thing is linked to what we've been talking about. I think very much so, but I do think it's slightly separate. So Matt has already alluded to this about the difference between anthropocentric and sentiocentric antinatalists. Now, like I said, I am currently doing a video on this, and I've pretty much finished the script, basically. But I haven't recorded it yet, so there is room for edit. So the reason I'm going to ask this question is because I want to see if any of you say anything that will make me change the script at all. And the question I want to ask you is, should animals be included in the definition of antinatalism? If so, what does that look like? And if so, why? Or if not, why not? So Les, do you want to go first on this? Because
Sure.
I think,
Yeah.
I think you'll be the one that probably holds us a different opinion to the rest of the three of us.
I believe I do. Yes. The idea that we can decide what's best for all of the universe, or even just Earth's ecosphere is another example of human supremacy. We are not smart enough to figure these things out. We don't like suffering. Okay, well, let's eliminate suffering. We don't really know. This is we think we're Homo sapiens. We're so wise, but maybe we're not. What I do think is that all of the domesticated animals that we have created, 96% of mammalian biomass is our livestock and us, and we're all suffering. Eliminate that, and we will be eliminating an awful lot of suffering. We'll be eliminating all that we are responsible for. We're not responsible for the billions of years of evolution that has created the biosphere that exists today. And if we want to think, well, maybe we could engineer some of these so they don't hurt, you know, we will cause more damage, more suffering, no doubt, than if we just left it alone. So that is my distinction, is that we just aren't that smart. And what 300,000 years ago is when we came onto the scene, and now we're going to decide what's best for the universe or best for billions of years of evolution. So no, that's my position on that.
Cool. Matt, do you wanna go next? Either if you want to respond to anything Les has said, or just respond to the original question.
Yeah, I would just say that this is a good subject because it's a problem in the antinatalist sphere where the majority of antinatalists, and I realize this every time on my YouTube channel I mention veganism, abstaining from animal products. I get a lot of pushback from people who are antinatalists, who consider themselves antinatalists, who indulge eating meat, dairy, eggs, and these products that cause nataling, animal nataling. Animals are forced to be born by the billions. And there's just so many things that are wrong with it, of course. And I guess that's a problem because they do consider themselves antinatalists, and I guess that's why I really like the term ethylism, because it's anti-lifism, and it's not about birth, it's just about life. That life is a negative, being alive sucks. So, yeah, I don't really know the solution. I think that's something I wouldn't mind hearing from others about that. Should the Sentiocentric and the Anthropocentric be separated into different philosophies? We consider the child-free argument to be completely different from antinatalism, even though it's kind of on the outskirts, the outliers. But those are people who choose not to procreate for themselves, but it's often for selfish reasons, and they don't want to impose. It's kind of like Les's view, but they don't want to impose on other humans, telling them it's wrong to procreate. They just think it's wrong for themselves. So yeah, I'd be interested to know if you think there should be different names. Like, should that be a name that becomes more popular for those of us who are sentiocentric antinatalists?
Ethan, what do you think? Do you think animals should be included, and what would that look like? Why do you think that, or why do you not think that?
Well, firstly, I'll just respond to one thing Matt said. Just at the very end, I find it interesting. Like, ethylism is generally thought of as like a subcategory of antinatalist. But like when I've talked about my view before, particularly with like some of these people who describe themselves as like against antinatalism. So ask yourself, is like actually one of these people who said this, but there's been other people. They've said that I'm not an antinatalist. Instead, I should call myself an ethylist. But I've always found that kind of absurd because, I sort of consider ethylism to be, one and the same or a subcategory. But to answer the question, I would definitely include non-human animals. I just think that any argument I accept, most of my belief on this subject rests on David Benatar's axiological asymmetry, and I'm very happy to accept that, and I would also apply that to animals, and I don't think there's like anything particular about animals that would change it for them. So, like, if it's all right, I'd like to ask you, Les, if you're aware of Benatar's axiological asymmetry, and whether you agree with it. And then I'm curious, like, uh, to a point, I understand what you mean by it. Like, it's a difficult question. Can humans impose this on non-human animals? But I wonder, is there something special about animals that separates them? I'm wondering what makes them so different.
It's not just animals. It's domesticated animals versus wild animals. We have created with the factory farming. You all know about that, and I think just about everybody does, even if they eat meat. Uh, we have created this horror show of our domesticated animals that we eat, and those are the ones I don't think we should exist. When I have an information booth, I have a banner above it that says, "Thank you for not breeding." And they come over and say, "What is it, dogs and cats?" And I say, "It's all domesticated animals, but especially humans, because the more of us that are bred, you know, we will have all the others bred. And the more of us there are, the fewer wildlife there are because of our encroachment on their wildlife habitat. So the difference I see is what we are responsible for. Yeah, I don't like suffering. I think that's bad too, but I don't think that can be the litmus test of everything in the biosphere. That pain and suffering is pretty much how things evolved. The lion got faster to catch the gazelle. Gazelle got faster to get away from being eaten, and that's what it is today. We don't like it. Well, that's too bad. It's not our call, basically.
Yeah, I think the main word in Les's philosophy is voluntary, right? So I don't think Les would be for imposing. This may be a question I'd be interested in getting your guys' thoughts on. Is should we impose antinatalism on other people? I know Les would, I think, would be against that because violate their autonomy, their individual rights, and it's not voluntary at that point. But could we incentivize not procreating, by saying you get more subsidies or something from the government if you are single, whereas now people are basically penalized for being child free because we have to pay for the education system in America anyways, which obviously I'm not using at all. I did when I was a child, of course, but I'm not bringing any more people into it.
That's very important. And I think it gets lost among environmentalists and even among population activists to a large extent, is that what we have now is a situation where hundreds of millions of couples don't want to procreate more than they already have, and they're denied the wherewithal. It's really a violation of human rights to not have SRHR universal. Sure, it would cost hundreds of billions, but we talk about caring for human life and all, but giving everybody on the planet the wherewithal to not procreate. There's 121 million planned pregnancies, not necessarily unwanted. Only 34 million of them make it to live birth. But when we talk about antinatalist activism, I think and overpopulation activism, I think we all all of us who care about that, need to focus on reproductive freedom and the right to not procreate.
Go on, Ethan, you
Then,
go.
oh, sure. So then, it seems like Matt, like what you said about Les's view that the voluntary aspect is so strong. It seems like maybe I was sort of neglecting that to a certain degree. Um, Les, for instance, like if you could press a button to skip to what I take to be your end goal of no humans, no domesticated animals. Uh, am I right that you wouldn't press it because you wouldn't have it wouldn't be of their own volition?
Well, it would certainly be tempting, if I could, no viable male sperm of Homo sapiens exists as soon as I push that button. Actually, that one might be more appealing because we've got a lot of messes to clean up. Just if we just went poof and we're gone, man, we didn't clean our room.
Hmm.
So, oh,
Go on, Ethan.
Okay.
okay, sorry.
No, you go.
Last question. But then I wonder if we have certain humans are not really capable of making voluntary decisions, right? Whether they be profoundly disabled, that could be one example. So I'm wondering if humans go, do we leave those behind, or what's your belief on that, Les?
Yeah, this is a phase out, like the motto, may we live long and die out. So as we go, 120 years, all of us are going to go if we stop procreating. So yes, we should take care of everybody that we can, and all the way out. Take care of that's something we're really not doing at all right now. Is caring for all the people that already exist. 2 billion are experiencing food insecurity, and we still keep producing more
Mm.
births. There are twice as many births as there are deaths. So we're really just feeding this treadmill. And I'm sorry, I may have gotten off track. Did I answer your question?
No, no, not quite. Like, so I'm wondering, for humans who are so profoundly disabled, such as that they can't voluntarily decide whether or not to have kids,
Oh, yes.
should we like put them in the wild and then
Yeah,
everyone
right.
that's of sound mind,
See how they do.
do a phase extinction?
No, that really is a tricky one. I've known parents who had developmentally disabled children who fall in love with each other in high school, and they're going, they can't really take care of themselves, and so they,
Hmm.
maybe we should let them have the fun and everything, but not create somebody they can't take care of. And who's going to decide if they can't take care of or not? It's really difficult to do that. But when in the case of the parents, they have the say. But yeah, that's a
Because
hard one.
I think that's similar to um, how I view the animal situation, the
Hmm.
wild animal situation. But that's enough. I'll
Hmm.
say, Lawrence, you've been trying to speak for a little bit.
Yeah.
No, it's all good. No, I was just going to say it's interesting with Matt's question because what I was saying before, to me, it maybe makes more sense to put more emphasis of the definition of antinatalism onto the evaluative side about existence being a harm. But then, if that's the case, does it make sense to say, or ask the question, should antinatalism be forced on people? Because I mean, yeah, you can force an idea on people in terms of like indoctrination through a school system or a religion or something like that, or parenting. But I think what Matt you were saying is like um, like force it on people in terms of like incentives and disincentives in society and stuff like that, like financial or legal or etc. etc. But that would only really apply if you were talking about antinatalism in the normative sense, right? About essentially not procreating. Um, so I just wanted to point out that like little thing there about it, the your answer to that question would again depend on what your definition of antinatalism is, but so that I'm not seen as dodging the question because I don't want to dodge it either. Um, if you are talking about the normative part of it of having kids basically, but also with wild animals as well, in terms of using some sort of, if you want to call it force or incentives in like political or economic incentives and disincentives. I think in the real world, if I'm speaking purely practically, I don't think hard um, levels of force would ever really work anyway, in terms of, making it illegal or something like that. I think the most that you would be able to do, and with any sort of political will, would be to change economic incentives. So in some way removing the incentives that promote procreation, and maybe putting in some incentives that dissuade, not dissuade, but like disincentivize it. So for example, I've heard the suggestion be put forward that, for example, everyone, for the sake of argument, everyone pays a flat rate of tax. Let's say everyone pays 15% tax, on income, but for each child you have, you pay 5% more, for example. And this would be an economic disincentive toward not having children, that seems to be not a hard line thing, in terms of, throwing someone in jail or something like that, which, um, I don't know if anyone serious is actually advocating for, but it does seem to be something that could be put in place in some way down the future, if the political cultural climate called for it, without having too severe a consequence. For example, one thing antinatalists, I presumably wouldn't want to do, is punish parents in such a way where it has severe negative repercussions for the child who's being created, because obviously none of us are against the child. We see them as the victim, so the last thing we want to do is make their life worse. So yeah, I think it's interesting. I think it's one of the most tricky topics. One, because it deals with this idea of force, which I think a lot of people are very uneasy about, but also the practical side of it is just so difficult as well. Like, how would that actually look in real life? Especially given that humans, almost by definition, are extremely pro-natalist. So antinatalists probably would never build any sort of political power to be able to implement anything like this. So yeah, I don't know if any of you had anything to say off the back of that, or in response to any of what you each said, before we move on to something else.
Yes, I created a contraceptive pressure gauge, and for a long time I was interview or survey people at information booths that I had. And it started
Mm,
out with reproductive freedom. Everyone has a chance to not procreate if they don't want to. We're not even there. The next one would be social encouragement not to procreate. And the next one would be economic incentive to not procreate. And then it went over into uh, economic. Actually, that one is kind of, how far do you go? And that's what you were talking about, Lawrence. And in a lot of cases, the people who are economically disadvantaged are also ethnic minorities. So it really is, it gets into some very difficult territory.
mm,
And then on over to clear down to nothing but force. You do not procreate, and people would go all the way up to the middle. Uh, you know, up to incentivizing people not to procreate, but it was consistent. I quit doing it because it's the same every year. What people's opinion is that actually forcing them not to procreate, that's wrong. I think that in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and shaming them, that was in there on the negative side. People didn't think we should shame people not to procreate, and then the economic one was, halfway in between. But
mm,
there are economic incentives to not procreate, especially that have been successful among teenagers, and it seems like that'd be worthwhile to encourage them not to procreate and get free long-term contraception.
mm,
Uh, we don't have a good way to have temporary vasectomies yet, but it's coming. It's been five
mm.
years away for 20 years now, so any day now. So yeah, that, that's another one of those areas where it's kind of this way or that way. It's a judgment call.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder if there are actually any sort of large scale surveys on people's opinions on implementing economic, like, public policy coming in that uh, pertains to incentives or disincentives to procreation. I don't know if any of you know, or if anyone watching knows and can put it in the comments, but it'd be interesting to see if there is any research on that. But before I ask the next question, I wanted to ask, I actually want to go back to Matt and just ask, Matt, what is your opinion on any use of force?
Well, it's a big job to get people to think a different way. Like we have this religion problem. This indoctrination. And like Les was saying, you have women who don't have reproductive freedom. They're basically forced into natalism. So if we can just give our attention to that, to the third world, like he mentioned, try to educate people on religion, how there's no factual basis for any of it. These are things we can do for incentives. Menem talks a lot about redoing the educational system, where you basically get rid of schools, and just as we showed during COVID, children can learn over the internet. We don't need all this infrastructure of schools and playgrounds and football fields, and so take the money we save from that into paying children to be educated. They get so many thousands if they graduate the 12th grade, kind of thing. So yeah, we can incentivize good behavior. Yeah, you should pay more taxes if you're a natalist, because you're using more. You're spending more from the taxpayers' coffers. So yeah, you should have to pay more. Child-free people should get tax breaks. I mean, those are simple things. And of course, part of me does think, yes, we should just make the meat industry illegal, and nataling illegal. But then there will be negative consequences for that. So if you have the minority imposing something on the majority, you could end up with a civil war and cause lots of suffering that way. But I think simple ways to kind of nudge people, and again, educating people about contraception, and making, if I had $1 billion, I would be opening up abortion clinics for free all along the Texas border. Things like that individuals can do, and that's not really imposing on anyone, I don't think.
Yeah, I think you.
Go on.
Sorry, just quickly. I think you touched on something there, Matt, which is that, as you say, it is so hard to change anybody's mind on anything. So I'm currently at university, but I'm in my mid-year break, and I've been doing vegan outreach. And while I've had some mild success, it's really disappointing. Like, just the lack of the interest anybody seems to have in philosophy and the way they live their life. But you mentioned education briefly, and I think if the goal is to decrease the amount of kids people are having, maybe there doesn't have to be all of this awareness about antinatalism per se. Not that people can't be aware of it, but maybe we don't have to convince people, because it seems as though when people become more educated, it's something that seems to happen automatically to a degree. I don't think that solves the whole issue.
Yeah, it's true. We have the negative birth rate, and if it wasn't for people coming to this country, we would have negative birth rate. And same with Japan and other countries; they're just naturally becoming antinatalist.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of the most economically developed countries around the world, have negative birth rates, and it's led to this sort of trending discourse that I've seen in mostly conservative circles about population crisis. And I forget his name, but there's this specific guy who made a documentary about it, who's really been doing the circuit, been on loads of different podcasts talking about it, called Birth Gap. Which I'm actually doing a live stream tomorrow morning for me. watching that, because I haven't watched it yet, but I thought it would be interesting. But yeah, there's this like trending discourse at the moment about like birth rates taking a nosedive, basically in more economically developed countries. So it does seem to be in line with what you're saying, Ethan. Like, to an extent, it sort of takes care of itself when people get more access to resources and all of this sort of stuff, and have a higher standard of living. Um, birth rates tend to drop. Um,
I
I've got
have. Oh, go
Go
ahead.
on, Les.
Well,
No, go on, Les.
I have been recently doing a binge on those, including the birth gap. And I think it is this extreme pronatalist propaganda, mainly to keep the capitalist system going. They get money to create these, like birth gap. They took 4 years and 26 countries. I'm going, and that's what you came up with? So watch for the conflation of replacement level fertility with zero population growth. They're not at all the same thing. And even in the birth gap, he calls it the tipping point, when women have fewer than 2.1. Well, we've been below 2.1 since 74, and we're still increasing. Our natural increase is still there. It took 37 years for South Korea, decades before the population actually stops growing. They aren't going to say that. They will keep saying growth rate, boom, because they don't understand that 1% times a huge base is more than 2% times a lesser base. So that they are uh, actually in Stephen something, I forget his name, the birth gap
Yeah,
person that you're,
yeah,
um,
yeah.
he does acknowledge. He said, yes, we will increase a bit, another billion or two, but it's not very helpful to look at those numbers. Not very helpful if you're trying to convince people that there's a huge population drop. And their only argument they have is that there won't be enough of us to take care of the old people. They try to
Mm,
make it more, but that's all they have. It's really, it's to keep capitalism alive. I think they're getting worried. It's like here we've been overthrowing governments to prevent to prevent socialism, communism, and now all of a sudden people are stopping procreating so much, and the pyramids isn't going to work anymore. So that I think that's why they're reacting so strongly. It's all
mm.
really, it gets tedious to watch those videos, birth to earth. Sorry, I went on too long.
Yeah, yeah. No. You need more consumers, need more taxpayers,
Yes,
etc. Need more people for the military. It's all sort of based on that one thing, right?
all of it. Yeah,
Um, yeah, yeah. No, I'm super looking forward to watching the documentary, because I think it's just going to be interesting to see how they present it.
it is.
Because I've watched a few interviews with this guy Stephen. I've forgotten his
Me
second
too.
name.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I haven't actually seen the documentary, so I'm looking forward to it. So I've got two more questions left. The first one actually just it came to mind earlier, because it's been mentioned a few times. So um, I think basically all of us have spoken about this already, but I think Les was the first one to bring it up, about how um, in Vehement, and it seems like in antinatalism generally, um, people tend to be against the breeding of domesticated animals, right? Um, do What are your guys' opinions on whether the definition of antinatalism that you run with, does it imply um, veganism? Should an antinatalist, if they were actually going to live by their principles, should they be vegan, or is there just a strong push towards that direction, or is it like, no, it's categorical, no, they do need to be, because if you're not, you're relying on the breeding of sentient beings coming into existence. So Matt, I'll let you go first on this one.
Yeah, I've made quite a few videos on this subject. I believe, if you're an antinatalist, I do believe it implies that you're against bringing any sentient being into existence, because they will be harmed. And we know in factory farming they're harmed horribly. And it's just not that difficult to abstain from animal products, in my opinion. Um,
Mm.
so at least I would say an antinatalist who does indulge in these cruel industries that cause birth and harm, they could at least admit that, I'm just an addict. I can't stop because I've been indoctrinated, but I don't promote it and don't defend it. The ones who defend it are the ones I don't understand. So yeah, I think definitely animal rights and antinatalism go together very well. It's concern for sentient beings and their feelings.
Mm. Ethan, what do you think?
Yeah, look. I certainly think antinatalism and veganism have a lot in common, and I think it's certainly true that if you're not a vegan, your whole lifestyle is predicated on breeding animals into existence. So, on the face of it, it doesn't seem to make sense to be against breeding and then support all of this breeding that's happening. Um, but unfortunately, I think when that's applied, it just seems to be the case that people will say, "Oh, why I don't care about animal suffering," and whether or not that's true might be a different thing. A lot of people
Mm.
are happy to claim they don't care about animal suffering, but if they end up seeing it, they might be
Mm.
surprised at the reaction that they have.
Mm. Les, what are your thoughts on this?
I think it depends on why a person is an antinatalist. You can be
Mm.
an anthropocentric antinatalist and just focus on human suffering. And of course, the fewer of us there are, the fewer beef animals there will be. But it really does seem like something that carries over. If you're doing it to minimize the harm of coming into existence, then you would probably stop eating meat and eventually lacto-ovo as well. But I don't think it has to be. I see it as another step along the way. Uh, it's kind of, there are people who say, well, I didn't have any children, so I can drive this great big old car, because
Mm.
I'm still doing less damage than the people who had kids, So uh, I don't like to get into lifestyle policing. In fact, I don't try to convince people of anything. I just present. I, I've kind of given up on that. I don't know if I ever did really try very hard. I just present what a great thing it is not to procreate and how many people would benefit and all wildlife and so on. And I don't know if I have ever actually changed anyone's mind who wasn't ready to have their mind changed.
Mm. Yeah, I think my opinions on this are I think antinatalism and veganism I think are very linked, but I don't think one inherently implies the other. I think um I think in most practical cases, um for an antinatalist to live by their principles, they do need to be vegan. Because if you are a non-vegan and um, get or your animal products in the conventional ways, buying it from a shop, etc., then you are supporting the breeding of sentient beings, and I think that's just the opposite of antinatalism, especially sentient beings that have such awful lives. Um, where I think there's a gray area, and I've seen people raise this, is that they can say that they're against the breeding of sentient beings, but not be vegan because, for example, they may be a hunter. So those animals are being bred not because they're demanding it, but those animals are just going to be bred anyway in the wild, and they occasionally go in and shoot them. Now, um, there may be other arguments that someone would present to that person not to do that, but I'm not sure they'd necessarily be antinatalist ones. So I think the two things are very linked, but I don't think it's inherently implied. Um, but I think there are good independent arguments to be vegan anyway. So I think all antinatalists should be vegan, but I don't think antinatalism entirely captures all like not all antinatalist arrows lead to veganism. But I think enough arrows generally lead to veganism that everyone should be vegan anyway. But that's kind of a separate question. Before I ask my last question, do any of you have anything else you want to say on that topic?
Yeah, I just say I think you put it quite well. Like I do think all antinatalists should be vegan, but that's just because I think everybody should be vegan.
Yeah. So my last question, and I don't know if this is going to be one that's going to take a relatively short amount of time or a relatively long amount of time, but so we've all kind of presented what we think antinatalism is, like the definition, what are the essential features. What do you think antinatalism isn't? What do you often see people conflate with antinatalism, whether they be antinatalists or not? You know, a lot of antinatalists will try and piggyback things onto antinatalism, which shouldn't be there. A lot of people who aren't antinatalists try to, push stuff, give antinatalism baggage that it doesn't have or shouldn't have. So yeah, what do you think antinatalism isn't? What isn't in the definition that you often see tied to it? So Les, do you want to go first?
Yes, I will go. So I'm a population awareness activist, and in communication with many others. There's one called Population Balance in the Twin Cities, and they have a new director, Nandita Bajaj, and she was on Growthbusters podcast and went off on how horrible antinatalists were and antinatalism was, and that it was giving all the population activists a bad name. What'd she say? It's built on a philosophical worldview that sees being alive as unethical, procreation as unethical. Okay, got that part right. There's a lot of suffering, but to have that as their main message seems to me very nihilistic way of approaching life. And so goes on with a few other things. I called the Growthbusters hotline, which they encourage, keep it under 2 minutes, and told how that was all wrong, but it didn't make the cut somehow. So what else did she say? A part of the argument was the people who are attracted to antinatalism tend to be nihilists and suicidal and so on. It's like, well, that has nothing to do with the philosophy. The philosophy stands on its own. So, and she's a prominent person in the population awareness movement. So that is one thing I see is not antinatalist.
Matt, do you want to go next? What do you think is not included?
Yeah, sure. I think some people, people outside of the movement conflate it with either eugenics or mass murder. And, we're not into saying this class of people can breed and this class of people cannot breed. We're not really trying to breed in any different traits or anything. And it's not about mass murder. This is about not bringing life into existence in the first place. So.
Yeah, no, 100%. I see that a lot. Ethan, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think a lot of good things have been said. Probably one thing I'd add is just that antinatalism is not. It's not about hating people. It's not about hating humans, even people who procreate. And if you take the view of ecological niches that's been talked about today, I think you can like seeing. I'm 22, right? Not that many people I know have kids, right? But some of them. And it used to be a source of suffering for me to just think about this person and all the suffering they're going to experience over their lifetime. And of course I still don't want them to suffer, but the mere fact that these people have kids, since hearing about this ecological niches has, relieved a lot of that suffering for me, at least.
Mm. Yeah, so my thoughts on this, I mean, I sort of, you guys have covered a lot of what I was going to say anyway, but I think yeah, two things I would really like highlight that I don't think um are included in antinatalism is the first one is like moral nihilism. I think a lot of people um see it for some reason as morally nihilistic, uh and honestly, I don't actually know how they get to that point. I think it might just be because they are sort of philosophically illiterate, or something. Because my understanding of moral nihilism is basically that you don't really think anything really matters, um, uh, but that's almost like the opposite of antinatalism. Like, like why do we care about this specific thing? Because we think there's something that matters going on there, right? Um, So I think that's one big thing, and the other thing is like uh, child hatred, basically.
Yeah.
Um, and I do think like one thing to say is that there are people online that do harbor this sort of negative view. Um, but I think one, those people are wrong, and I think antinatalists should try and nurture a culture where those people actually don't really feel comfortable to express that view online, or at least if they do express it, they know they're going to get a lot of pushback. Um, because I mean, the way I see it, I just see it as pure victim blaming. Basically, it's like
Hmm.
it's like those are the ones that we see being harmed. Why would you have any sort of hatred towards them? Like, okay, you may see them as annoying or um, uh, incompetent, all of these sorts of things. Um, but they can't help it. I mean, they're kids; their brains haven't fully developed, and it's not their fault they're in this situation. Um, so, yeah, I think I wanted to highlight those two things. I see those two things lumped in with antinatalism all the time, and I think antinatalism is the opposite of both of those. Um, so, yeah, I wanted to mention those two things. Um, so to round off, what I wanted to do is revisit the definitions again, just in case anyone's thoughts had changed at all throughout the course of this discussion. So to close out, I want you each to do two things. So the first thing is, can you give us, if you like, an elevator pitch? I'm sure you will know what an elevator pitch is. Like, you're in an elevator with someone for 15 seconds, and you've got to give them the you know bullet point punchline message of what is antinatalism. So if you could put into like one or two sentences what you think the definition of antinatalism is. um, and the second thing is, if you could just tell people where they can, find out about more of the stuff you do and follow you. And I'll include all links in the description. So, Ethan, do you want to go first?
Sure, yeah. Well, I would just say antinatalism is a philosophy that considers coming into existence to be a harm for the being brought into existence. Um, I just don't think that. I think that if you accept that, there's no reason to create sentient life out of non-sentient matter. Which, if you take the theory of abiogenesis, is really what all that life is.
Mm,
And if you want to find any more of my stuff, I've got a YouTube channel, Meta Ethics, MEHTA Ethics. You can just find that on YouTube.
nice one. Matt, do you want to go?
Sure. Yeah, I would say antinatalism is the position that deliberate procreation is unethical, and non deliberate procreation, such as by animals, is unfortunate. And procreation is unethical because you're imposing harm and death on someone or some being, it violates their consent. In any other circumstance, it'd be considered a criminal act. It's not kind. It's the opposite of kindness. And it's also misanthropic in that it harms the world.
And where can people find your
Oh,
stuff?
sorry. Yeah, they can find me on Life Sucks on YouTube. And they can find my coloring book on Amazon. It's called The ABCs of Antinatalism.
Yeah, I'll link it. And also, I can't remember. I think Ethan said this off the recording, but I also have a copy of that. So yeah, at least two of us in the call do. Well, three of us, because I'm sure Matt has a copy as well. Les, do you want to go next?
Yes, I have many opportunities to give the elevator speech as people come up to my information booth, which I have whenever I can get one going, and they say, "Well, what's this all about?" And a lot of times they'll have kids, and I'll say, "Well, the idea is we don't create more of us, so we can take care of everybody who's already here." I don't ever lead with antinatalism because the whole kind of the art form of the voluntary human extinction movement is here's this idea that is just so repugnant, and yet it's all done so sweet and nice with smiling dinosaurs and all the wonderful things. So I like the contrast. And if I lead with really creating somebody does them a lot of harm, even though I agree. But later on in discussions, quite often people will say things that kind of lead into that, and I now know, okay, I'm on to that. Say, yeah, that is a very good reason not to create more than we already have. So I guess that's longer than an elevator, right? How many floors we went up? 20 floors,
You were in the Empire State Building, so
Okay,
don't
yeah,
worry.
okay, it counts.
Yeah. And where can people find your stuff, Les?
Oh yeah, vehement.org.
Okay, cool. So I'll link whatever all of you guys have said in the description, so people can just find it super easy. But yeah, thank you all for coming on. I've been looking forward to this discussion. I was like really interested to see what each of you would say, and how we'd bounce off each other and stuff. I have no doubt that there will be lots of people in the comments giving their definition and saying that we're all batshit insane and that we've got it wrong, and that
Hope so.
we don't know about the true meaning of antinatalism. And I look forward to being destroyed with facts and logic in the comments. But yeah, thank you, like the three of you for coming on again. I'm sure we'll do something again in the future, if not as a group, but individually, because I'm looking to host more discussions, but just got to come up with topics and also find the time and stuff like that. But yeah, thank you all for taking part in this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This was
Been fun.
really great.